Welcome to Podcast 83, a regular look at the news, stories, and trends related to Michigan's 83 counties from the Michigan Association of Counties.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Podcast 83, the podcast put on by the Michigan Association of Counties. Again, we're joined by Deena, Bosworth, Samantha, Gibson, and Madeline Fata from the MAC staff here to talk about what's going on in the Michigan legislature the past week, maybe this upcoming week. Not a whole lot of changes, right? Since last week's podcast, kind of the same issues still hanging out there, mainly because the House didn't meet last week. Senate had some committee meetings. So let's talk a little bit about timing. What do we expect this week in the legislature? What changes could occur? Anyone can chime in. Madeline, you want to kick us off?
Sure. So Tuesday, April 16th is the date of the special elections here in Michigan. There are 2 House seats that need to be filled. The first is the 13th district down in Macomb County, and then the 25th House district in Wayne County. We do expect that both of those seats will be filled by Democrats, which would then bring the legislature up to 56 Democrats, 54 Republicans moving forward after this week. And that's been the huge holdup on the vast majority of what's going on in town.
Yeah, they've just been on hold this whole time, right? They've been on hold and trying to, wait for their majority before they really were able to move on different votes to get bills out of the House, which I'm sure Sam is going to lament on here in a minute when we talk about child court funding. But yeah, but those election results won't be certified for what, 8 to 10 days after the election, I think, because of the, early voting and then waiting for the rest of the absentee overseas ballots to come in. So, although the election will happen, we'll know who will win tomorrow night, they won't actually be seated for almost 2 weeks. So still struggling.
Yeah, still puts us about the end of April to have the full chambers. And, some might argue that the Senate, it's held up stuff in the Senate, right? Because they don't necessarily want to send bills over to the House because they may want something from the House at some point. So why send their bills over? Why show your cards too early when you may need those cards later on, right? So that's kind of held everything up in Lansing, which you may not think, well, the Senate has a change. Why aren't they voting on anything? Well, it's kind of chess. So kind of holds everything up.
We see that, we've seen it, I keep talking about revenue sharing trust fund and I can't for the life of me, understand how it's wrapped up in different issues, but we've been waiting on them to move on that revenue sharing trust fund bill since November. But rumor has it it's tied up with a lot of the other priorities from the Senate. And so they want the House to move certain things. I think it's prescription drug prices, something, and something else on auto no fault insurance. And so we really do need, somebody to have a majority in the state House so that we can get some stuff moving through the process.
Yeah, so let's talk about committees this week. Deena, it sounds like there may be a committee or there is scheduled a committee hearing that has to deal with short-term rentals. What do those bills do?
Yeah, so it's a whole package of bills, 5437 through 5446. And it amends all different kinds of acts, some of the Convention and Visitors Bureau stuff, hotel motel stuff. But the primary bill is Representative Joey Andrews' bill, and that's House Bill 5438. And it's the Short-Term Rental Regulation Act. And what that's doing is saying, well, local units of government, you can't, zone so that they can't be there. You can't do exclusionary zoning. But it requires the department, can't remember which state department, to collect all of the information from these short-term rentals, register them, and then share that information with local units of government. And they're also putting different requirements in there. You've got to have smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors, and you can regulate how many are actually within your jurisdiction. It's just you can't do exclusionary zoning and zone them out. Another key component of that is the excise tax. So they're putting a 6% excise tax on short-term rentals. And they're gonna take that money, 1% of it goes to the department to create this database and communicate with local units of government. But then the other 5% are split with the municipalities, given back to the municipality where the short-term rental is located. Now, currently, that's just a city, village, or township, and it does not include counties in it at all. We've been working with the other interest groups to come up with something that recognizes how involved counties are in this process. So we have, over 20 counties that do some sort of zoning for their local units of government, and will likely be responsible for a lot of the regulation that's in this act. And so we're working on amendments that would send some of that excise tax to those units that are doing the work. And talking a little bit about public safety, but I'm not sure the public safety piece is going to be included in that excise tax. So stay tuned. I'll be testifying on Wednesday. We'll see what happens.
So Deena, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, I might catch you off guard, but what is concerned to short-term rental in these bills? Any person, like if you rent your place for 1 week via these online platforms, or is it a certain minimum, or?
Yep, totally catching me off guard.
That's fine.
But I can look at it, and I do think that there's a de minimis amount included in there, Steve. I just got to go through and read it again and tell you what that de minimis amount is.
That's okay. I was just curious because of course, people have always rented properties, especially when you get into some lakefront communities, they just didn't really have a place to do it like the Airbnbs or the VRBOs. They might have just done it word of mouth to friends, to family. So I wonder if it has to do more with if you're putting it on these platforms or not, or I don't know, but I guess you could always still not do it on these platforms and no one would know that you're renting them, but who knows? But I guess we'll learn more this week as those come up for testimony. Moving on to a topic we've talked about a few times now. We're still getting questions about trial court funding. Again, deadline is approaching. Sam, why don't you talk a little bit about where we're at with the trial court funding legislation? Again, we're a week closer to the deadline. What do we expect to happen there?
So there's not a ton of updates since we went over this on last week's podcast. It's been 4 weeks now since the House has been in session, which means that's 4 weeks, 2 of which they were on spring break. But 4 weeks since we've had any potential traction on the 2 House bills moving forward. And just as a reminder for everyone, those 2 trial court funding bills are 1, the sunset extension, and 2nd, a SCAO bill that requires them to do data collection on local court costs and revenue, and then turn over a report to the legislature in 2 years. Those 2 bills are cross-tie barred, meaning they cannot move forward to the governor's desk without one another, which has posed some significant issues in the House, given that 54-54 split. With the election being tomorrow and assuming that the Democratic majority is reinstated, I think, whenever those seats are filled and the elections are certified, we will see progress on those bills getting out of the House. In the meantime, though, the Senate Judiciary Committee is going to have a hearing on 2 identical bills that were introduced in the Senate, just as a formality, move the process along so that whenever the House bills do get over to the Senate, which could very well be April 24th or 25th, that those House bills can be held on the Senate floor. The earliest they could be voted out with the 5-day rule would be April 30th. And obviously that doesn't leave us a ton of time before May 1. So we're just over 2 weeks out from that expiration date on fee authority for courts. It's increasingly likely that this legislation will not be signed before May 1, which then brings us to what happens from a funding perspective. It's Mac's position that the state should appropriate the funding, approximately $1 million a week, to courts and their funding units in order to, make up for the funding gap that would occur. I don't have an answer yet as far as logistically the day-to-day in courts. How are judges impacted if they lose the authority to impose those fines and fees? How are their dockets affected? That said, this occurred in October of 2022. The governor's office and the state court administrator's office remedied the situation, a year and a half ago, and it was status quo. So I'm hopeful that that will be the case this time around. But for now, I think it's safe to assume that we're going to go beyond May 1 before these bills are signed.
Yeah, so nothing we haven't talked about before. Really, it's nothing haven't experienced before. If you look at the last sunset date, where kind of ran past that deadline again, and the state appropriated dollars to do that. So that's hopefully we'll either get passage before then and signature by the governor before that date, or the state will step up and cover those dollars in that time frame where there's that gap. So thanks for that update. All right, finally, let's talk conference. I don't know, I put a link to the conference in the chat. I'm not sure how that shows up on the recording if it doesn't, but of course you can go to our website, micounties.org, go to the top 2 events, down the conferences. You can see the registration is open for our legislative conference. It does close this Friday. The conference is April 29th through May 1st here in Lansing, Michigan. Great conference lineup. Madeline, Samantha, Deena, anyone you want to highlight on the breakouts? We've got about 12 different breakouts, some plenaries. Anyone you want to talk about or highlight specifically?
I can jump in. Dr. Sarah Mills from the University of Michigan is going to be doing a breakout session on implementing Public Act 233, which is that change in renewable energy siting. It's still an active issue, but she's at the forefront of all of it. So if you want to learn more, she is a wealth of knowledge.
All right, great. Sam, Deena?
I'm looking forward to a presentation on the state of childcare in Michigan, how that affects, our workforce, who's in, who's out of the workforce, access to childcare statewide, and how that kind of ties in with the Population Council's report. They had said a big issue here, keeping young people and young families in our state, is a lack of access to childcare. So I'm curious to see what the department has to present on that.
Great. And Deena?
We don't pay a whole lot of attention to, really things that are affecting what do we do pay a lot of attention to it? But one thing I'm looking forward to is we're going to have a panel on deer population and how you manage that and what happens with, outdoor recreation. And we were finally able to get the Department of Natural Resources to come in and talk about some of those things that are affecting, hunting and that sector of tourism across our state. So I think that'll be a fun one to listen to. Plus, we have that legislative panel. So we're going to have several legislators, a Republican and a Democrat from each the House and the Senate, come in and talk about what's really happening, what they foresee happening in the near future in the legislature, things they're prioritizing and working on. So I'm looking forward to that one too.
Yeah, and then of course we have our legislative reception on Tuesday evening from 4:30 to 6, which is well attended by legislators in Lansing. We have Admiral Cressy coming in from Washington, D.C., who's a great speaker on leadership and George Washington's leadership styles and some of the things he encountered and how that can be carried over in today's times. So again, the registration's open till this Friday, and then it closes. Please get over there, get signed up. We'd love to see you here in a couple weeks here in Lansing. So with that, unless there's anything else, we'll go ahead and close out for the week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Podcast 83.